All right, this week I'm going to talk about Orientalism. This is a great week to talk about Orientalism because we are reading 1001 Nights for class, and we're going to start out with what is Orientalism. It is a field of study based on a geographical, cultural, linguistic, and ethnic unit called the Orient, according to Edward Said, who has written extensively on the topic of Orientalism. He notes that the field of study formally began in the 14th century when the church commissioned chairs to study mainly biblical languages um, at a number of the Catholic universities at the time. Arabic, non-biblical maybe, but still it was a prominent language in the region of the Holy Land, obviously. What is the Orient? Well, it is basically an area to the east, which for Europeans is an area to the east of Europe. Um, and areas that have a culture not derived from Europe or not dominated, so to speak, by Europeans. It is often subdivided into the Near East, the Middle East, and the Far East, which are all very nebulous terms. That reveal a Eurocentric bias. The Near East is the part of the Orient, or East, closest to Europe. The Middle East is a little far away, and the Far East is even farther away. It would include, to some extent, parts of Africa, particularly Egypt, and then go eastward all the way to Japan, Indonesia, part of the British colonies like Malaysia. I wouldn't say Australia is typically part of what we would consider the Orient, but it's also to the east of Europe. Now, when we talk about like the terms Near East, Middle East, Far East, I used to argue a lot with a friend of mine from J School, Naresh Fernandez, who grew up in India near the Portuguese or former Portuguese colony of Goa, and hence the name Fernandez. Um, and he complained that those terms, near, middle, and far east, are all very Eurocentric, and that those terms are not as people, say, from South Asia, where he grew up, would define themselves. Um, a lot of times I disagreed with Naresh, but this time he scored points, and I've tried to remember what he said. And so I try and avoid the terms that tend to be more geographically specific. So Southwest Asia, South Asia, East Asia are better terms to use, but typically we don't use those terms in popular culture. There are problems with this notion of Orientalism because what our bias, which is still, even in the United States, Eurocentric, because it's a dominant European culture here, we look at people from the quote-unquote Orient as other. They're exotic, they're dangerous, they're inscrutable, there are all sorts of stereotypes that apply, or that are stereotypes that are applied to people from the Orient. Um, Another problem is that these people of the Orient are defined by people from outside the Orient. So if you're like Naresh from South Asia, you're not given any agency in defining who and what you are. There is also a problem considering that with the legacy of colonialism as well as Western racism, that people from the Orient are inferior to people from the Occident, so to speak, or the West. Another problem that Said had with the concept of Orientalism is that there is no study of Occidentalism. The dominant culture defines the topics for study. we don't look at ourselves from an outside lens. Said notes that that's impossible. There's racism, there's power differentials, there's this history of colonialism, and that most of the scholars of Orientalism grew up steeped in the endemic racism, imperialism, ethnocentrism of their home culture in Europe and, by extension, North America. Orientalism leads to this objectification of people from this nebulous entity called the Orient as, again, exotic, mysterious, hard to understand, inscrutable, as dangerous. They look different, they act different, they speak different cultures, they have different religions. All of this outsiderness makes them a threat to the dominant white culture, allegedly anyway. And during the 19th century, early 20th century, we had something, there's this widespread panic, not the band, but a widespread panic called the Yellow Peril. And it was like white people were scared shitless about people from Asia, particularly East Asia, particularly the Chinese. And you see that this fear expressed, as well as hatred, racism, all that other stuff, in this ad for the magic washer, which was a laundry detergent, not a dishwashing detergent, a laundry detergent. I'm guessing they sold a lot of detergent by advertising that we should kick the Chinese out. Of course, the Chinese were often doing laundry for white people, so that would certainly be a peril to the economic aspirations of the people that sold magic washer. The yellow peril permeated our culture, permeated popular culture. Even today, it permeates popular culture to some extent. For instance, the horrible portrayal of a Japanese person by Mickey Rooney in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's insulting. It's just bad, painful to watch for me and for a hell of a lot of Asians. But, particularly late 19th century, early 20th century, there was no filter. One of the most popular, book series of the time that spread into, movies and television was the Fu Manchu series by Sax Rohmer. Rohmer was an Englishman. He fully bought into this notion of yellow peril. His books drip with racist notions about Chinese, particularly the main antagonist, who is this mysterious Dr. Fu Manchu. I am a son of the Yellow Emperor. I have Chinese roots, and I should be offended by the portrayal of Chinese in Sax Rohmer's novels. But frankly, they crack me up. Because to see all these white people scared shitless about this one Chinese guy, it's just hilarious. But, read it, read the novels, be prepared to be offended, watch Tony Randall or Christopher Lee play the evil Dr. Fu Manchu on the movies. Have fun with it. Don't take it too seriously. But remember that there is a racist undertone to those. All the scares about the Yellow Peril led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Congress, in its infinite wisdom, proclaimed Chinese laborers, or the coming of Chinese laborers to the United States, a danger to the good order at certain localities within the United States. Now, maybe folks like my great-grandfather would put too much starch in your shirt collars. I don't know. Maybe overcook the General Tso's chicken. Whatever, stuff happens. But anyway, these fears of the people from the Orient led to this act that barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States. Now, there was some grandfather, if they were already in the United States, they could stay, but if they went to China and tried to come back, they wouldn't be allowed. My great-great-grandfather was one of those. He wasn't a laborer, so to speak. He was a merchant by then, by the time the act was passed. But he would have had a hard time getting back in the United States if he'd gone to China. Now, my great-grandfather, however, Yi Jiaoliang, was born an American citizen. He was born in San Francisco. By the 14th Amendment, he is an American citizen. But he was also a focus of the Yellow Peril. Being born in California didn't make any difference when it came to the institutional racism of the United States government, or the California government for that matter. So he had to prove, he went back to China several times, came back to the States. Every time that he came back, he had to prove he was an American citizen. And it wasn't just an interview at the border. He was held in detention. He could be days or weeks until the immigration authorities were satisfied he was an American citizen and they had to let him in the country. I'm pretty sure they didn't want to let him in the country, but they had to. People like him, again, they went through, were subject to these immigration interviews. They had to submit their documents. So if they lost their documents, they were in trouble. They would have to get affidavits, and an affidavit from your father, to your Chinese father, saying that you were born in San Francisco wasn't enough because your Chinese father's Chinese and they can't testify in court. You would have to get a white person also to testify that he directly knew of your birth in this country before you would be allowed in. Now, there was a phenomenon at the time called paper sons that really took off after the earthquake in 1906, when, in addition to the earthquake that destroyed San Francisco, there were extensive fires, including City Hall. A lot of the local records were destroyed. So a lot of Chinese laborers would come in claiming to be sons of Chinese people already in the country. And many of them got away with it. I was told my great-grandfather probably was, but when I did find his birth certificate in the Exclusion Act file, he obtained a copy of his birth certificate in 1904, before the earthquake. So that was one strike against him being a paper son. And I have since, within the last few months, found a second cousin in China. So I know who was a descendant also of my great-grandfather. And they have documents that show that my great-great-grandfather, my putative great-great-grandfather, is an actual great-great-grandfather. So there's no paper son situation here. No doubt as to the legal status of my great-grandfather's presence in this country. But he was treated as less than. He was identified not as a laundryman in his death notices in Dayton, Ohio. He was identified as a Chinese laundryman. He was still different, even though he was an American citizen. A white person who owned a laundry or operated a laundry would be identified as a laundryman back then. But no, my great-grandfather was a Chinese laundryman. He's an Oriental. He's inherently different from any other laundryman from Eastern Europe, for instance. Then we have my grandmother. American as apple pie, born in Dayton in 1920. A smart lady, beautiful lady. I miss her. She died in 1979. My grandmother played violin in the symphony orchestra, played Carnegie Hall, for instance, in New York. She was featured in a Cold War propaganda concert that was broadcast to Asia by the federal government. She worked before that. She worked with the Army Signal Corps unit that was training Chinese Americans to go to China to help in the war effort against Japan. After that, my grandmother worked for Bell Labs. She helped design Nike missile components, but she still looked Asian. Her name is Asian, and she's still treated as an outsider in American society. Was she less American because of her origin? I don't think so. But then my mom was treated the same way. I've been treated as less than because I'm Asian. I've even been told to go back to China. I've never been there. It's hard to go back. My mom and I were both threatened with death in Louisiana because we were Chinese, and people in 1962 didn't want us Chinese people moving into their neighborhoods. So that otherness is pervasive, and I would argue still pervasive in society. And nowadays, our government is led by someone who's hostile to the Chinese, unless he can make money off of them. He's hostile to anybody from the global south, particularly our neighbors in Mexico, who he called rapists when he announced his run for the presidency in 2015. It's the same shit, different century, maybe different specific targets, but this concept of you're not white enough to be one of us, so you're exotic, you're other, you need to be treated as less than, still runs rampant through our society and is something that we should guard against, which is, the kind of things that Edward Said criticized when he wrote about Orientalism beginning in the 70s. So here are some of my references so that you can see that I had them. And I will say, looking at the slide on the Chinese Exclusion Act, is that there were several. This was the first one, but they were other versions of the Asian Exclusion Acts were passed that targeted more than just the Chinese. It was like Koreans, Japanese, you name it. They tried to keep them all out for a time. I guess they still are. Or we still are, not they. We still are trying to keep them out. All right. I will shut up now and hope you got something out of this.